Hello and welcome to the programme. You're watching UATV Live. Now, today, Ukrainians have been voting for their next president. The nation of almost 42 million people and over 30 million voters have been choosing among 39 candidates, which is a new record for the country. Now, most of the candidates are taking part in the election for the first time. The polling stations were opened at 8 a.m. and closed, well, not long ago, about 12 or 13 minutes ago now. So how has the voting process been going on, and what is next for the candidates? Well, I'm pleased to discuss this today. We welcome into our studio Petro Burkovskiy. He's an analyst at the Ilko Kucheriv Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Hello, Petro. Thank you very much for coming to our studio on a Sunday.
Good evening. It's my pleasure.
And it's certainly been a very historic event, and we just got the results of the national exit poll not long ago. We can show a graphic on the screen perhaps in a few seconds about what those results were. You can see there that Volodymyr Lensky, he's just got over 30%. Petro Poroshenko, 17 or between 17 and 18%. And not far behind, Yulia Tymoshenko with 14.2%, and then Yuri Boyko and Anatoly Gritsenko there. So why don't we talk about those results? Are you surprised by those national exit polls? Is there anything that strikes you?
Well, the main intrigue of the presidential elections before December 2018, the main intrigue was whether current president could make it through to the second round. But in the last 2 months, or during the presidential campaign, the intrigue has changed. Then it was the two questions: what would be the victory for, what kind of big victory would be for the Volodymyr Zelensky, and who of the two politicians and very bitter rivals, Tymoshenko and Poroshenko, would make it through to compete with Zelensky in the second round. And as we see on these results of the national exit poll, conducted, by the way, by the Democratic Initiatives and other two institutions. So now we see that in the runoff there will be a contest between Volodymyr Zelensky and current President Petro Poroshenko.
Yeah, well, that's the national exit poll. And you said that there is a margin of error. What is this margin of error in terms of these results?
Well, the internationally established margin of error for this kind of activities like exit poll is 3%. But in 2014, during the presidential elections, the discrepancy between our exit poll and the official results of the Central Election Commission was just 0.9%. So I would say that right now there is a clear picture of the second round. These are Zelensky and Poroshenko. However, there is still a chance that some other candidates like Boyko or Tymoshenko herself, they could try to contest the results, and so we still have to wait for the official results, for the official counting procedure of the District Commission and the Central Election Commission.
And how does it vary from region to region in your experience? Is the voter turnout usually more in the eastern regions of Ukraine or in the western regions? And how could this potentially affect the steps going forward?
Well, if you look at the official information, it was released just at 3 o'clock. That there is no great difference between western and eastern regions. So the average turnout was 45%. And if you look at the central and the eastern regions, and in the western, there is no great difference between them. So according to the previous experience, of course, it depends what candidates, to whom these candidates appeal. If you look at the 3 top or 4 top candidates, they all appeal to the whole Ukraine. And so if you look at the results of the opinion polls, you can see that the voters of Zelensky, Tymoshenko and Poroshenko, they are distributed all over the country in all regions. And that made the people to go to the polling station and to vote, despite the region of living.
And a lot of analysts and opinion makers said that in the days running up to this election that perhaps a lot of the people who would support Zelensky would be younger people instead of older people who would perhaps go for Tymoshenko or Poroshenko more. So do you think that these exit polls that we saw with Zelensky over 30%, do you think that this reflects that actually younger people are potentially interested and want to have a say in the country's future more than people previously thought?
It is possible. It is possible, and I would say that Zelensky result is remarkable. These elections are really remarkable for the one thing that the outsider, the newcomer, wins the first place in the first round of presidential elections. It has never happened before in Ukrainian history. That proves that Zelensky really managed to appeal to his target audience. And if you say whether he made people, younger generation, more interested in politics, I think that they were interested in politics, but a lot of people were disappointed and even frustrated with the old politicians, and that's why a lot of people voted for this kind of a fresh face.
I think it's interesting that you say that a lot of people were perhaps disappointed in the results, perhaps over the past 5 years, especially since Euromaidan. But do you think that's actual disappointment, or do you think it's because people after Euromaidan had such high expectations of how the country would change? I mean, if you think back 5 years, we were talking about Russia's invasion. Russia was trying to partition off part of Ukraine, Crimea. The invasion of Crimea happened after that time. And in 5 years, there has been a lot of progress in Ukraine. So do you think actually it's more high expectations, or do you think there's certain sectors where perhaps there are disappointments?
I think it's yes, we can explain it by some psychological things. For instance, the younger people, they want to live now and to have these opportunities because these are the best years of their lives, and of course they want to have the best opportunities to improve their living. And the last 5 years were really hard years for all stratas of Ukrainian society, whether they were young people or pensioners. Still, I think that a lot of people disappointed because what was promised by president and what was promised by the governments, the two governments, post-Maidan governments, was not accomplished. A lot of people were disappointed with the corruption scandals and with the sluggish progress of reforms, and a lot of people realized that the old politicians that were in politics for many years before Maidan, and they managed to get to the power after Maidan, that a lot of people think that they are just not capable, that they are just not up to the job to change the country, and that's why they decided to try something new.
Yeah, I want to talk about the people who are temporarily displaced from occupied Donbass and also from Crimea in a second. But before we get to that, I would like to ask you, do you think that the fact that Zelensky in the national exit polls, at least at this point, has had such result, do you think, would you consider that a protest vote as such? Or do you think that people are just looking for any sort of alternative to what they have now?
Well, Zelensky managed to appeal to the protest voters, that's for sure. But at the same time, he mobilized people who were disconnected from politics and who regard politics as a kind of dirty thing. And they think that if the new people are voted in, are brought to the power, that they have better chance to change the whole system. If you look, for instance, to the American elections, and we can draw maybe a parallel, so a lot of people in America who were disappointed with the last 10 years, the years of Bush Jr. administration, the years of Obama administration, and the recession, and they voted for the Trump, for the complete outsider who promised to drain the swamp. And Zelensky, he did just the same. He promised to drain the swamp.
But I mean, I don't know if that's a fair comparison, is it? Because Donald Trump's campaign, I remember following this, and really it was just full of slogans that people just, repeated, and promises that perhaps they couldn't make. I mean, for example, the wall. I mean, that still hasn't been built. So, do you think that's fair, comparing Zelensky and Trump? Or What similarities do they have, do you think?
I'm not comparing Zelensky and Trump. I'm comparing voters.
The voters who would vote for them.
The voter base of the two candidates. There is similarities that. Okay, yes, for Trump, the generation was there were senior people and elder people who voted, but who were disappointed because all that they saved for their lives, that was broken by the recession, and the political class did not manage to make their lives better. And here we have young people who have very tough choices. They have either to go to emigrate from Ukraine, or they have to work for the very little money, and that makes impossible to improve their lives. And Zelensky promised that he will change the political system, he will try to shake the whole political class, and he will bring a political system closer to the people's needs. That was his major promise, and that is very appealing to the young people.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting to talk about the candidates perhaps a little bit later, but I want to talk about IDPs and people from Crimea, because obviously a lot of the people who have been displaced also want to vote as well, but in the past it wasn't so easy to change, for example, your place of registration. But before we talk further, I'd like to show a report that we had earlier on today about IDPs voting. Let's watch.
On May 25, 2014, Olha wasn't able to cast a vote in that year's presidential election. A polling station never opened where she lived. In 2014, only a few polling stations across the Donbass were opened. Some even risked their lives to vote.
We couldn't vote because there were no polling stations. At that time, the safety of the election committee members and of people in general was, so to say, more important than to vote for someone. It was simply impossible.
Now, Olha is a Kiev resident and registered to vote early. This is a significant moment for her.
It's very pleasing when you can once again use your right to vote in the presidential election. We are not only choosing our fate today, but the fate of our children.
Olha is worried about the second round of voting. According to the law, the Central Election Committee must announce the results of the first round no later than the 10th of April. After this, Olha will need to register once again. With the second round of the presidential elections being held on April 15th, Olha says there might not be enough time to sort everything out.
There are only 5 days to change my voting address after the day when the first round's results are announced. I won't have this possibility. I will have to change our voting address again.
The Ukrainian parliament recently passed a law allowing the internally displaced to vote according to their current address, regardless of their address of registration. Reported by Inessa Zanina, UATV.
So there you go. That was one of our reports earlier about an IDP voting. The war, Russia's war in Ukraine, has been going on for 5 years now. How do you think that the process has changed for IDPs? Do you think that there is more support for them now? And do you think perhaps that this could also have an effect on results that we might see in the second round?
Well, you see, 5 years ago, these people were just moving outside the conflict zone, and for them, there were much more important issues. For most of them, there were much more important issues, just settling in a new place, looking after their children, after their elders. And of course, if they had an opportunity, yes, we have to acknowledge that 5 years ago, the law was not adapted to the needs of these people. Right now, as we see from the video from this report, there's opportunities were created, and the people, if they wanted actually to cast their vote, they can do this with no obstacle. So the Russian propaganda very often repeats that the IDPs are rejected by the Ukrainian government, by the Ukrainian state, that the authorities refuse to oblige to secure their rights. Right now we see that that's not true, and this is the main thing, that these people now, they really, if they want, they can vote, and there are no significant or artificially established barriers to deny their voting.
And there's also been quite a good campaign, I think, to let people know that they can vote, especially if you are not aware of how to change your registration. I think probably people might think that it's quite a bureaucratic process, that it takes a lot of paperwork. And in fact, a lot of people who left the occupied Donetsk and Luhansk regions left without paperwork. And this was part of the problem. We even actually have, I know some people who were told once that they had to go back to Donetsk to go and pick up their paperwork and then come back again. And this was even when it was occupied.
Right. And I would have to admit that a lot of work was done by civil society organizations, by the organizations which take care of rights of the IDPs. So they spent a very long way. So really they lobbied, they advocated, and they pressured the government. And what we see right now is just not, I can admit that this is a result of the civil society pressure put on the government. And that's why these people managed to get their rights protected and respected.
And civil society still plays a key role in these elections. We look at the number of observers. There are about 2,000 short-term foreign observers and more Ukrainians. But how important is civil society in making sure that the elections are fair and free?
Well, very important. For instance, the National Exit Poll is the initiative of the civil society. It's an Ilko Democratic Kucheriv Foundation, the Kyiv International Institute for Sociology, and Razumkov Center. Also, right now, after polling stations are closed, there will be a parallel vote count made by the civic network Opora. This is non-partisan network and independent network. So, and this is all done to keep situation in Ukraine stable and not to allow political forces to play with people's popular sentiments and not to allow political forces to divide the country. So this is the civil society works to control the voting and to keep the integrity of the voting and to keep the fairness of political competition. So yes, the role of civil society is very important.
And I've been watching actually throughout the daytime, and often they keep updates on perhaps where there have been potential violations. These are all documented. Often they have evidence to back up these claims. So later these will be investigated as well.
Yes, and as you see, since 2014, it was very important to prove actually that the revolution was democratic and that we are developing democracy, not the authoritarian regime. And that's why, and the civil society presents this testimonies to the external world that Ukraine is really democratic, it's an open society. So it's a very important work for the Ukrainian image abroad, for the Ukrainian image in its relations with key Western powers, to show that the electoral process is safe, there is an integrity of electoral process, and that Ukraine is still keeping itself on the pace toward democracy. That is very important.
Yeah, and also what I've really noticed today on social media, for example, is a lot of the soldiers who are on the front line, we'll have a report about it in a second, but a lot of the soldiers who are serving on the front line, who are in their dugouts, still in position, have also been able to vote as well. In fact, before we talk more about this, I think we'll be able to play one of our reports from our correspondent Ihor Medilan, who's on the front line. So let's have a play now.
We started everything in a military style. From early morning there has been a lot of activity, and it's clear why this is so. In the early morning it's been fairly quiet on the front line. So in the first few hours we have the soldiers from the front line coming in to vote. The battalions which are stationed on the front line, they came and voted. Everything is going well so far. There's been no disruptions or interference.
Of course I voted. I want things to improve. Maybe the war will end in the near future. I'm originally from Donbass myself, and I just want it to end. I'm hoping that the new president will be able to end it, with our help, of course.
So there we go, just a couple of views from soldiers who are on the front line. Unfortunately, some of them perhaps couldn't vote, but most of them did in certain rotations. So what do you make of the setup, how soldiers are allowed to vote? Do you think it's effective in terms of making sure that the vote, again, is democratic in terms of observers on the front line, because that brings in security issues as well?
Well, it's very hard to evaluate right now. If it's very interesting, so it will be very interesting to look at the results of the voting and how these votes are counted and how votes are distributed among different candidates. Actually, I don't think that there will be a kind of very huge preference towards one or other candidate. Even in 2014, it was what traditionally our military are just a replica of our society, and I expect that their voting will be somehow much the same as of the whole country, except the one thing that military professionals are much more eager to vote for more professional politicians. So I don't expect that the result of Zelensky would be so high among military servicemen.
And do you think that war still plays quite a key role in how the voter chooses in elections?
No, as we heard from the military service woman, she said that I voted for peace. Yeah. So these are just people who have their families back and who want to return to their families. That means that I think that their motives would be much more similar to the civilian population. And that is my
But they're
guess.
so much more affected by the war because they're actually working in the war zone. I mean, for example, if you walk down the main street in Kiev, you would never think that 700 or 800 kilometers away there is a cyclical war that's going on where sometimes there's a lot of shooting, sometimes it's very quiet. So I find it perhaps quite surprising that they don't vote for the person who they believe in most, who could end the war, who would perhaps have the most leverage.
Yes, but at the same time, military professionals, and they can, how to say, assess more critically. They can be more critical towards top politicians, because they see how the situation in the front line could be improved, how their supplies could be improved, and that's. I think I think their voting could also depend on their reflections. What other conditions are, as you said, on the front line? So they could be even more critical about the authorities than even civilian population, and vice versa. Of course, I think it depends. I think even among the military troops, it will depend on the very certain specific conditions in specific military units.
Yeah. And also, I mean, if we look at the exit polls as they stand at the moment, obviously we have another one coming up at 11 o'clock this evening, but as they stand, we can presume that perhaps Zelensky and Poroshenko will go into the second round on April the 21st. But what I find quite surprising is that Volodymyr Zelensky hasn't named any sort of foreign minister or defense minister, key roles that he would have to fill. So do you think this is a tactic of some sort, or do you think he's still unsure about who could fill these particular roles? And what sort of effect could that have on his ratings?
Actually, from the very beginning, they were not quite sure that they can make through in the second round of voting. But I think that in March, their team started to think about whom to select and whom to present to the people in the second round of voting. So yes, I think that will be a great public pressure and great public attention toward how Zelensky would deal with all the people and with all nominations for the most important post in the government. And first of all, there will be very interesting to see whom he will present as his security part of his possible future presidential team.
His security team is
right. So Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Policy, the Security Service head, the head for intelligence, maybe some major advisors on foreign and security policy, whom he will select as his representative to Donbass, whom he will select as his representatives to Moscow, how he's going to communicate with the leaders of France and Germany in order to continue negotiations in the Normandy format, whether he wanted to change completely the negotiation format. All these issues would be very, very interesting for many people.
Has there actually ever been a case like this where you've had a very established political figure like Mr. Poroshenko facing a political novice, you could say? I mean, many people label him as a comedian, but actually he's a businessman, Volodymyr Zelensky, as well. So has there ever been a case where you've had one candidate who has little experience, perhaps in politics, and another one who has quite a lot of experience?
I can only remember that in 1991 there was Leonid Kravchuk who had a very good experience, but in the party politics inside Communist Party of Soviet Union, and Vyacheslav Chernovil, who was an outsider, but at the same time he had a very huge experience as a dissident, as a person who combated the Soviet system. So, but still, he had no experience as a not a politician, but as a bureaucrat. So we can, to some extent, it can be compared.
So it's difficult, though, to compare.
No, it's very difficult. Today we have a very new situation in Ukraine when outsider person, the man without a political experience, wants the first place. And I think that for him, his victory would be not only the very huge surprise, but also a huge burden. Now he has maybe to explain and to persuade people that he is serious about fighting for the presidency.
Yeah, and not just playing the same character on a TV show.
Right, because in the runoff, it's not a TV show; it's a real reality show. I would say, if you like.
Yeah, and also we're talking about defense and security issues, but foreign policy is also very important because Ukraine still wants to boost its international image. It still wants to strengthen cooperation with, for example, the European Union, with the US. I know this year that the IMF loans are up for, a big chunk of them are up for repayment. So also foreign policy is incredibly important. And some people say that Mr. Poroshenko has been very effective. You know, he speaks English very well. He's a good negotiator. I mean, is that a fair statement? Do you think that Zelensky has a lot to live up to in terms of the foreign policy aspect?
No, I think that as we see, the foreign policy and security policy are not the strongest points of his campaign. And I think that he will try to appeal to the voters, to the other opposition leaders who lost in the first round. And if we look at the agenda of the opposition leaders, these are anti-corruption campaign. These are fight against poverty and fight against impunity of political class. So these are three most hottest topics and issues. And Zelensky would appeal to anti-corruption campaign, to impunity of politicians, and to fight against poverty. So I think he would continue to, to mobilize his now potential support around these three issues.
Yeah, and also I think it's incredibly interesting as well that many people are still asking why Mr. Zelensky wants to be president. There's still, I mean, not perhaps a convincing answer in some electorate's eyes why he wants this top position. He has his TV show, he's a businessman, but why the president?
And now, in order to answer this question, he has to prove that he is an independent person. And there are very serious concerns that he is dependent on some other people, including the owner of the 1+1 TV channel, Igor Kolomoisky. In the second runoff, he will have to explain why he, because explaining why do you want to become a president, you have to explain that you are independent and you have your own mind and you won't be influenced by this kind of oligarchic pressure groups who are also part of the past.
Yeah.
So he have to prove that he is broken not only with the old political class, but with the shadow political class presented by Ukrainian oligarchs.
Yes.
It will be a very tough issue for him.
Yeah, and a lot of Ukrainians, not just in Ukraine, but outside of Ukraine, have been voting as well today. I think there was over 400,000 Ukrainians who were voting in 72 countries, and there was 101 polling stations. Do you think that the foreign, I guess you say Ukrainians abroad, how big an effect do they often have on presidential and parliamentary elections?
So it's a pure mathematics. So their share is not so, how would say, significant. So we have to admit that the voting inside Ukraine is the most important. The voting outside Ukraine is just showing whom Ukrainians who emigrate but still keep their ties with their motherland, with their countryland, how they see the situation in the country. Because their voting can show whether they accept reality or they want to have a major change.
Yeah.
So this is just...
They have a different perspective, I guess. They see perhaps Ukraine and Ukrainian reforms or progress from a different way. Perhaps?
No, I think from the very same way as the Ukrainians who live here, because many of Ukrainians who vote abroad, they have relatives or friends still in Ukraine, and they communicate with each other thanks to Facebook or some other social network, Skype, and so on and so forth. And so sometimes when I visited United States, our diaspora in the United States said that we are so closely following the situation in Ukraine due to internet. So we can read the same news as you are. So we know everything about Ukraine.
In fact, I know probably some people who live abroad, some Ukrainians, who actually follow Ukrainian news more than people in Ukraine do.
Yes, it's possible.
I think it's a common thing. We have about 30, 40 seconds left. So I would like to ask one final question. How do these presidential elections perhaps affect parliamentary elections later on this year?
So I would say that the presidential elections is just the first round of the parliamentary elections. And whoever becomes president, his primary task, if he wants to become a real president and to implement the changes he promised, he have to create his coalition inside the parliament, because the government would be the major tool of implementing the promises made during the presidential elections.
Well, perfect. Petro, thank you very much for coming into our studio today, especially on Election Day. It's been great having you, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.
And
thank you very much. That was Petro Burkovskiy. He's an analyst at the Ilko Kucheriv Democratic Initiatives Foundation. Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more on UATV, and the news in Russian is next.